Your large capacity tote kit is going to contain everything that you need to make your tote, starting with the licensed fabric that you selected. So that's the camouflage choices that we see there. You'll also get the appropriate amount of lining fabric, and in addition to that, you'll get our signature stabilizer. And our stabilizer is actually printed with the sew on the line instructions, so it's very easy to do. And then you're also going to get a written instruction sheet as well. And lastly, you're going to get a plastic base, and that's going to go in the bottom of your high capacity tote so that you can kind of stabilize the base. You can leave the plastic as is or cover it with fabric. Our first step is we're going to cut around the pattern that's printed on the stabilizer, and we want to leave about a 1/2 inch around each edge. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut our solid lining fabric into a rectangle that's 26 inches by 39 inches. Then we're going to get our camouflage fabric. In this instance, we're using the mossy oak habitat, and we are going to take that piece of fabric and subcut it into one 26 by 39 inch piece for the tote body, and then we need a 7 inch by 22 inch piece for the pocket. We need four 4-inch by 30-inch pieces for the straps, and we need two 2.5 by 25-inch strips for the binding. The next step is we're going to layer the camouflage fabric and the lining fabric right sides together. So that means pretty sides together. When that's done, you're going to take your stabilizer, center it on top. So now you'll have actually 3 layers: the stabilizer, the camo, and the lining. And you're going to pin that in place. And you want to put your pins as close as you can to the dotted lines. The dotted lines are where we are eventually going to sew. So you will be pinning on 2 sides close to the dotted lines. When that's done, sew all 3 layers together on those dotted lines of both sides. Our sewing is done on the dotted line, as you can see, on both sides. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cut on the solid line, but we're going to cut all the way around the edge, all around the perimeter of the entire bag on that solid line. We've trimmed all the way around the edge of our tote. Now we want to make sure that when we are trimming that we follow that solid blue line and trim our corners and up into the points if that solid blue line indicates, because that's going to help us when we turn this right side out. And now we're going to turn our bag right sides out. What you want to make sure when you do this is that you really get those points out so that when we sew our bag together it looks really nice. So if you have a little bit of a sharper object, like perhaps we're using a letter opener, as you can see here, and we're just going to insert that into some of those corners just to push those seam allowances out and get us a nice crisp corner. Now that our corners are all turned out, we're going to lightly press the edges, and that's going to really give great shape to our bag. Our pressing is complete, and at this point you can leave the tote bag as is, or you can add any additional quilting if you like. If you want to put more stitching in it, why don't you refer to the instructions that you got in your kit, because we give you some ideas there. Our next step is we're actually going to set the tote bag body aside and start working on the straps. To make our straps, we're going to take 2 of the 4-inch pieces and we're going to lay them right sides together, but perpendicular to each other, so we can make a nice mitered corner. So what you're going to do is take a marking pen and a ruler, and you're just going to mark an angle, a right angle from one corner to the other, and that's going to be our sewing line. And when we sew on that, it'll make a nice mitered corner. Our stitching is done on the angle. Now we're going to trim our seam allowances to 1/4 inch, and then when we're done, we're going to press that open, and you're going to see how beautifully that piece for the strapping is mitered. Sometimes we press seams to one side, but in this case we're going to press them open. And look at how nice that miter looks. Now we're going to trim our strap to 54 inches, and we've actually already done that here. So we have our 54-inch piece, and now we're going to take on the short ends and press under 1 inch. So this is actually wrong sides together, press under 1 inch. Now we're going to create a center pressed line. So fold your fabric on the long way, wrong sides together, so that the pretty side is facing up, and just press right down the center. So fold it in half and press right down the middle, and that will create a reference line right in the center of that strip. Now open the strip of fabric and fold the raw edges of each side toward that center pressed reference line. So again, wrong sides together, and press one more time. So essentially what you're doing is you're bringing a finished edge to each side by folding that raw edge toward the center and pressing that into place. And what we're going to do is go all the way down our strip and do that. And when that's done, we're going to make one more fold in our strip to create our strap. So we've actually got that done here. Save you some time so you can see what that's going to look like. So this is our strip that's been folded. The ends have been folded under. Our 1 inch has been folded under. Then we folded it in half again, and folded it one more time. And now we take that strip over to the sewing machine and we sew very close to the edge. Our 2 straps are now finished, and we've top stitched both long edges. So that's complete, and we're going to set that aside and begin working on the pocket. So the pocket fabric you already have cut. It's 22 inches long, 7 inches wide. You're going to fold that right sides together, and you're going to stitch in a 1/4 inch seam allowance on that short edge. And when you do that, you're essentially creating a tube. So let's get that stitched in a 1/4 inch. We're then going to turn it right sides out and top stitch along that stitched edge. We're going to make 4 1-inch marks on the body of our tote bag, and this is going to help us figure out where to position the straps. Starting from the side edges, you're going to want to go in 7.5 inches and make a mark. And then you're going to also want to go the other direction, 14 inches down from the top as well. And where those 2 marks intersect, you're going to make about 1 inch long drawing, and that's where we're going to eventually put our straps. So you're going to do that on both sides of the top and both sides of the bottom, making 4 1-inch marks. Position the pocket on the mark lines, making sure that top stitched edge that we initially did is facing toward the outside and the folded edge is facing toward the inside. And now what we're going to do is pin that in place, and we are actually going to stitch around all 3 sides. Let's take our first strap and position one end on the marks that we had previously made, and we're going to actually bring that strap all the way around, make a little turn at the top and bring it back down to the other side, positioning it right on the line that we made. And you'll notice that the strap covers the raw edge of the side of the pocket beautifully. Once we pin that in place, then what we're going to do is sew both sides of those straps down on both edges, stopping about 2 inches from the top of the tote bag. And we want to stop so that we have enough room to add the binding. When we have them pinned and sewn on both sides, then we're going to go back to the bottom. We're actually going to make an X. We're going to sew an X right at the bottom, and that's going to help reinforce that strap onto the tote bag. Our straps are sewn on, and you can see that we stopped about 2 inches from the top edge on either side, and we'll finish that off a little bit later. And then also note that we made the X's toward the center to reinforce the straps onto the bag. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually fold right sides together, and we are going to sew our side seams. So those get sewn in a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side. Our side seams are sewn, and now we're going to finish off what looks like the corners of our tote bag that form the base. So pick up your tote bag, and you're basically going to just position that center seam line from the side across the bottom and pin in place, opening the seam allowance. And that is going to form that gusset or that base. Flip it over and center that side seam allowance across the bottom, pin and sew in a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Our gussets are now sewn, so the base of our body is together. Now we're going to work on the binding. So you want to take the 25-inch strips by 2.5 and you want to join them together. We're going to use the same manner that we did when we were making the straps and put them perpendicular to each other, draw a diagonal line and sew together. And so once we trim those seam allowances, you're going to see that again you have that nice mitered edge, and that is going to make one long binding strip. Let's press that seam allowance open to create our full binding strip. And then once that's done, we want to find one of the ends of the binding strip and fold that short end 1/2 inch under and press. And now what we're going to do is take the long edge of our binding strip, fold it in half, wrong sides together, and press so that we create a long binding strip that has the camo on both sides. With the bag still turned with the wrong side or the lining side out and the straps neatly tucked inside the bag, you're now going to take your binding strip and starting with the edge that you have pressed under, you're going to place raw edges together of the binding strip against the bag and pin through all layers. So start at one point and continue pinning raw edges together until you have that binding strip all the way around the edge. When you get to the end, do not cut off any extra binding. Just leave it for now. Our pinning is done, and now we're going to go to the sewing machine. But I want to explain how we're going to do this. So we start at that finished pressed end and go about 2 inches beyond that. And that's where we're going to begin sewing. At that 2-inch point, I want you to back tack and then sew in a 1/4 inch all the way around the edge of the tote until you get to within about 2 inches of that pressed edge that we first started out. So you're going to have a little tail hanging there. Our binding is sewn on as far as we can at this point. Now what we're going to do is we're going to trim that extra binding tail 1 inch beyond our beginning folded edge. So let's trim that. Then we're going to tuck that end of the binding into the beginning folded edge and pin. So we're kind of hiding it in there. And then we're going to pin and sew through all layers to complete sewing our binding on. Let's turn our bag right side out. Now that that is complete, we're going to take our binding strip, bring it around from the inside, fold it over to the outside edge of the tote, and we're going to top stitch it in place. You can either hand stitch it or top stitch it. We're going to machine stitch it very close to that edge. Our binding is now complete and in place. Now we're actually going to make sure we finish the straps by stitching on either side up toward the top, right up to the binding, and then putting the X in to reinforce it. Our last step is to insert the plastic base. And again, you can just put the plastic base in there. If you want to cover it with fabric, that's a nice touch too. We hope you've enjoyed making this beautiful tote bag.